There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from pushing at something that simply will not move. Perhaps you know it well, the ache in your shoulders from forcing a problem that refuses to budge, no matter how hard you try. Tonight we will sit with a different idea entirely, that being stuck is often not a sign to push harder, but a sign that something else, something quieter, is being asked of us. You do not need any prior knowledge of Taoism, the ancient Chinese tradition we will draw from tonight, to follow along. You only need to be willing to rest and to listen. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. Tonight we will move through 13 short chapters, each one offering a different image of stuckness and a different way of meeting it. A swollen door, a stubborn knot, a frozen bucket at the edge of a well. None of it requires effort from you now, so wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. There is an old idea in Taoist thought that stuck things are not always broken things. Sometimes they are simply being approached the wrong way. We tend to believe that more force will always solve more resistance. But Wu Wei, effortless action, suggests something different. It suggests that resistance is information, not an obstacle to overpower. When something will not move, the wisest response is rarely to push harder. It is to notice what the stuckness is actually telling us. A door that will not open is not asking for a stronger shoulder. It may be asking for a different hour, a different angle, a different kind of attention altogether. Not more strength, more listening. In a small village at the edge of a wide valley, there lived an old woman known simply as the keeper of the storehouse. She tended the village grain stores, and every villager came to her at one time or another, asking for a portion to be measured out for the season. One late summer evening, a young farmhand named Wen arrived at her door, his shoulder pressed against the heavy wooden frame, sweat on his brow. "I cannot get in," he said. "The door has swollen shut. I have been pushing for an hour. My shoulder is bruised. The grain inside is kneaded before nightfall, and I do not know what else to do but push harder." The keeper of the storehouse looked at him for a long moment. She did not move toward the door. Instead, she sat down on the low stone step beside it and patted the space next to her. "Sit," she said. Wen hesitated. "Sit? The grain is needed. The animals must be fed before dark." "And will the door open faster if you stand there glaring at it?" she asked, and there was the faintest smile at the corner of her mouth. Wen, frustrated but out of better ideas, sat down beside her. The two of them looked at the door together. It was an ordinary door, made of pine, hung on iron hinges that had darkened with age. The wood around the frame had a faint sheen to it, almost like it was sweating in the heat of the day. "You see how the wood looks swollen," the keeper said. "Wood breathes just as we do. In the damp heat of summer, it drinks in moisture from the air and swells at the edges. That swelling is what is jamming the door in its frame. It is not broken. It is simply too full of the day's heat and damp to fit through the space it was cut for." Then what do we do? Wen asked. Wait for winter. The keeper laughed, a low, warm sound. No, we do not need winter. We only need evening. Watch. She rose, and instead of approaching the door, she walked to the well at the center of the courtyard and drew up a bucket of cool water. She returned and, without a word, began trickling the cool water along the hinges and the frame's edge where the wood met the stone threshold. Why water? Wen asked, watching closely now despite himself. Cool water draws the heat out of the wood, the way a cool cloth draws fever from a brow, she said. It will not happen in a heartbeat, but wood that is cooled contracts. It pulls back into itself. Give it a little time and a little patience, and the door will remember its true size again. They sat together as the light dimmed toward orange, and the keeper told Wen to rest his shoulder, to stop bracing himself for another push. It feels strange to do nothing, Wen admitted, like I am failing at my task by sitting here. You are not doing nothing, she said. You are doing the one thing that will actually work. There is a difference between idleness and right timing. One wastes the moment, the other waits for it. After a while, she ran her palm gently along the door's edge, feeling for the give in the wood. Almost, she murmured. Wen leaned forward. How do you know? It looks the same to me. Because I have sat with many doors, she said, and I have learned that the wood tells you when it is ready, if you are quiet enough to feel it instead of busy enough to fight it. A short while later, as the sky deepened toward violet and the evening cool finally settled over the courtyard, the keeper placed her palm flat against the door and pushed, not hard, only firmly, the way one might nudge a sleeping animal awake. The door swung inward with a soft groan, easy as a held breath, finally released. Wen stared. An hour of pushing did nothing, and then with barely any effort at all. That is because the hour of pushing was working against the day, the keeper said, stepping inside to measure out the grain he had come for. And the moment of patience was working with it. The door was never your enemy when the heat of the day was, you simply mistook one for the other. But how did you learn this? Wen asked as she filled his sack with grain. The keeper considered the question as though no one had asked her that in a long while. When I was young, this same door swelled shut on a night when the grain needed covering before a storm. I took an axe to the frame, thinking I could force my way through. What happened? I split the frame, she said simply. For an entire season, the door never sat right again. I had won my battle that night and lost something far larger in the process. Wen was quiet, turning this over. So the damage from forcing it can outlast the problem it was meant to solve. Almost always, she said. Most people only feel the relief of finally breaking through and mistake that relief for wisdom. They do not see the cost until later. She handed him the full sack, then placed her weathered hand briefly on his shoulder, the one he had bruised against the door. There is no shame in finding a door stuck, she said. The shame, if there is any, is in refusing to stop pushing once the truth has shown itself. You stop today. That is not failure, Wen. That is the beginning of a different kind of strength. Wen thought about this as he hoisted the sack onto his back. It does not feel like strength. It felt like giving up, sitting on that step. Many things that are not giving up feel like giving up at first. the keeper said. It only proves itself afterward in an unsplit frame. He carried the grain home that night, thinking less of the grain than of the stillness on the step and the quiet certainty in the old woman's hands as she waited for the wood to be ready, rather than forcing it to obey. In Sufi poetry, there is a similar understanding of timing and surrender. The poet Rumi often wrote of doors that open only when the seeker stops battering them with the fists of the will and instead waits with an open, attentive heart. In this tradition, the locked door is sometimes seen as a teacher in disguise, not a punishment, but an invitation to soften the grip of the ego long enough for grace to do what force cannot. Two threads run through this teaching. First, the Sufi poets often describe longing itself as a kind of heat, much like the swollen wood in our story, and they suggest that the very intensity of wanting something can be what jams it shut. The fevered grasping warms the situation rather than cooling it. Second, there is the recurring image of patience, sabr, not as passive waiting, but as an active, trusting stillness, a willingness to remain present without forcing the outcome, trusting that what is meant to open will open in its own right time. A well-known teaching attributed to this tradition says that the breeze enters only through the window left ajar, never through the wall struck again and again. The wall does not need to be punished into yielding. It needs to be left, for a while, to its own nature, just as Wen's door needed evening, not strength. You may not have a swollen door tonight, but you likely have something that feels just as jammed. A project at work that has stalled, no matter how many hours you throw at it. A conversation with someone you love that keeps circling the same point, getting more heated each time you push for resolution. A decision you cannot seem to force into clarity, no matter how many lists you make or how late you stay up turning it over. Consider for a moment that the stuckness is not a flaw in you. It may simply be a sign that conditions have not yet cooled, that the moment has not yet arrived, that what you are forcing needs evening, not effort. You do not have to abandon the project. You do not have to give up on the conversation. You simply might set down the pushing, for now, and let some cooler hour do what your gripping hands cannot. Notice, without judging it, where in your body you are still bracing your shoulder against something. Let that place soften. You do not need to solve anything in this exact moment. The door of sleep tonight does not need to be pushed open either. It only needs you to stop pressing against it and let the evening do its quiet work. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A knot pulled tight under strain behaves strangely. The harder you yank at its ends, the more fiercely it resists, until the rope seems to fuse into a single stubborn lump. Yet the same knot, approached with slack and patience, often unravels with a touch so light it barely qualifies as effort. This is the nature of many of our stuck places. We assume that strain calls for more strain in return, but strain answered with strain only deepens the knot. Wu Wei effortless action asks us to do something almost unnatural in these moments, to give slack first before we try to find the thread that leads out. The tightest knots are undone not by the strongest hands, but by the gentlest patience. A young rope maker named Bian had been sent by his master to deliver a coiled length of new rope to a boat builder on the far side of the harbour. The rope was thick, freshly twisted, and Bian had tied it around a wooden post for safekeeping while he ate his midday meal at a nearby stall. When he returned, he found that the rope had somehow tangled itself around the post in a knot so tight that his fingers could not even find where one loop ended and another began. He pulled at it from every angle. He braced his foot against the post and hauled with both hands. The knot only grew smaller and harder, like a fist clenching tighter the more he struggled with it. An old net mender who sold her wares nearby had been watching him for some time. She set down the net in her lap and walked over, without being asked. "You are feeding the knot," she said. Bian wiped sweat from his forehead. "Feeding it? I am trying to free it." "Every pull you make tightens it further," she said. "A knot like that does not loosen from force, it loosens from slack. You must first give it room to breathe before you can ask it to let go." Bian frowned. "There is no room. It is solid. I have tried." "Sit," the net mender said, and gestured to the low bench beside her stall. Reluctantly, Bian sat, and she lifted the knotted rope into her own lap, turning it over slowly, almost lazily, in her weathered hands. "The mistake almost everyone makes with a hard knot," she said, "is to keep pulling on the two ends that are already under strain. Pulling on strain only adds to the strain. What you must do instead is find a fold in the rope that still has some give in it, a loop, however small, that is not yet locked, and gently push slack into the knot from there, rather than pulling tension out from the ends." "Push, not pull," Bian repeated, watching her fingers. "Yes, it feels backwards. Most people's instinct when something is tight is to pull harder on what is already tight. But a knot is not undone by tightening its grip on itself. It is undone by being given just enough looseness, in just the right place, that it forgets to hold on so fiercely." She worked in silence for a while, and Bian noticed that her hands moved without urgency, almost playfully, testing small folds of rope, abandoning some, returning to others. "How do you know where to push the slack in?" Bian finally asked. "I do not always know right away," she admitted. "Sometimes I have to try several folds before I find the one with enough give in it to matter. But I have learned this. The spot with the most give is rarely the spot that looks most promising. It is often a small, unremarkable loop near the edge of the knot, not the thick, tangled center everyone stares at first." "That seems like it would take forever," Bian said. "Wouldn't it be faster just to cut the rope and tie a new length?" The net mender paused and looked at him with something like amusement. "It would be faster, and sometimes when a knot truly cannot be undone, cutting is the right and honest choice. But this rope was meant for the boat builder's rigging, a single unbroken length, strong along its full span. Cut it, and you weaken it at the very place it must hold the most weight. Some things are worth a slower patience, precisely because cutting them would cost more than the time saved." Bian watched her fingers continue their slow exploration. After a while, she found a loop near the knot's outer edge that yielded slightly under her thumb. She did not yank it. She simply held the tiniest bit of slack there, and with her other hand nudged one strand a finger's width through the gap she had created. "There," she murmured, more to the rope than to him. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the knot began to loosen. Not all at once, but in small surrenders, one strand shifting, then another, the tight fist of rope softening fold by fold, until with one final easy tug it fell open in her hands, restored to a simple, uncoiled length. Bian stared at it. "An hour of my pulling did nothing. You undid it in a few quiet minutes." "Because you were arguing with the knot," she said, handing the rope back to him. "I was listening to it instead. Every knot has at least one place where it is willing to let go a little. Most people never find it because they are too busy pulling on the places where it is not willing to let go at all." Bian coiled the rope properly this time, looping it loosely so it would not tangle again, and thanked the net mender before continuing on toward the boat builder's yard. He walked more slowly than before, turning her words over. "Why do you think I went straight for the ends?" he asked, half to himself, before he had even reached the gate. The net mender, still close enough to hear, pulled back without looking up from her own work. "Because the ends are where the rope shows you its strain. But strain is never where the answer lives. The answer is hiding in the part of the knot that still has some softness left in it. You only have to be patient enough and humble enough to go looking for that instead." Bian paused at the gate and turned back once more. "Will you teach me to find that soft place faster next time?" The net mender smiled. "I cannot teach you to find it faster, only to remember to look for it at all. The looking, the willingness to stop pulling and start searching, you can carry with you starting today. And if I forget, if my hands go straight for the strain again, out of old habit, then a stranger will remind you, the way I have," she said. "None of us learn it once and keep it forever. We simply get reminded again and again until the reminding becomes a kind of knowing." Bian carried this thought all the way to the boat builder's yard, turning it over with each step until it had settled into him as quietly and completely as the knot itself had finally come undone. In Lakota and other Native American traditions, there is a similar understanding of patience and right relationship with difficulty. Many teachings speak of approaching a hard situation the way one approaches a wild and wary animal, not by chasing it down, which only drives it further away, but by sitting quietly nearby until it chooses, in its own time, to draw near. Two threads from this tradition echo the rope-maker's lesson. First, there is the teaching that force disturbs the natural order of things, the web of relationship that connects person, animal, land, and spirit, and that disturbing this order to get a quick result often creates a larger imbalance that must later be repaired. Second, many of these traditions emphasize listening before acting, a deep attentiveness to what a situation is actually presenting, rather than what we assume it to be. Elders are often described as those who have learned to wait and observe long enough to see the one true opening, rather than striking out at the first opening they imagine. A teaching shared in several Plains traditions speaks of the hunter who is taught, above all else, patience, for the animal that is chased reveals only its fear, while the animal approached with stillness may reveal where it is willing to be met. The knot, too, reveals only its strain to the one who pulls, and its softness only to the one who waits. Think of the places in your life right now that feel like a knot pulled tight by your own hands. Perhaps it is a friendship where every attempt to clear the air only seems to wind the tension tighter. Perhaps it is a piece of writing, or a plan, or a budget that you have pulled at from every angle, only to feel it grow more rigid the harder you work it. Notice whether you, too, have been pulling on the strained ends, the obvious places, the parts of the problem that shout loudest for your attention. There may be a quieter fold somewhere in the situation, a small place with a little give in it that you have walked past without noticing because it did not look important enough. You do not need to solve the whole knot tonight. You only need to wonder gently where the give might be. Perhaps it is a single kind sentence instead of an argument. Perhaps it is setting the plan down for a day instead of forcing one more revision. Let your mind rest on this question rather than straining against it, the way the net mender's fingers rested against the rope rather than yanking it. And as you lie here now, notice that sleep itself is like that smallest loop of slack, found not by gripping for it, but by softening enough to let it find you. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A key that will not turn in a stiff lock tempts us toward a particular kind of foolishness. We jiggle it harder. We force the angle. We grip until our knuckles ache, certain that one more burst of effort will win the day. But a lock does not respond to passion. It responds to precision. Wu Wei teaches that some problems are not problems of strength at all, but problems of alignment, a small adjustment, a slightly different angle, a moment of stillness to feel where the mechanism actually wants to give. Forcing a misaligned key only wears down the metal, or worse, snaps it off inside the lock entirely, turning a small stiffness into a real obstruction. The wise hand does not grip tighter. It listens through the fingertips for the angle the lock is already offering. There was a locksmith in a walled town who was known for his patient hands. One winter evening, a merchant named Hu came pounding on his workshop door, breathless, a brass key clenched in his fist. "My strongbox," Hu said. "I cannot get it open. I have turned this key until my wrist aches and it will not budge. There are payments inside that must be settled before the tax collector arrives at dawn." The locksmith, an old man with ink-stained fingers from a lifetime of fitting tumblers and pins, set down his tea and gestured for Hu to sit. "Show me," he said. Hu produced the strongbox and the key, demonstrating with visible frustration how the key slid in easily enough, but refused to turn even a finger's width in either direction. "I have tried twisting it left. I have tried twisting it right. I have tried pulling it half out and pushing it back in. Nothing works," Hu said. "The lock must be broken." The locksmith took the key gently from Hu's hand, as though receiving something fragile rather than stubborn. He did not turn it at once. Instead, he simply held it still in the lock, feeling its position with his fingertips. "What are you doing?" Hao asked. "Just turn it." "I am listening to the lock," the locksmith said. "Before I ask anything of it, I want to know what it is already telling me." "A lock cannot tell you anything. It is a piece of metal." The locksmith smiled, the kind of smile that comes from long practice rather than amusement. "A piece of metal can tell you a great deal if you have spent enough years with your hands inside such things. This key is sitting very slightly too high in the channel. Do you feel how it rests, just barely, against the upper edge?" Hao frowned. "I feel nothing of the sort. I feel a key that will not turn." "That is because you were not feeling for anything. You were only pushing. Feeling and pushing are not the same action, though they often happen with the same hand." The locksmith pressed the key down, the smallest fraction, no more than the width of a single strand of hair, and held it there with one steady finger while turning with the other hand, slowly, almost lazily. The key turned. Hao stared as the strongbox lid lifted with a soft click. "That is all it needed? I spent half an hour fighting that lock, and you solved it with a motion I could barely see." "You were not wrong that something needed to move," the locksmith said. "You were only wrong about what and how much. You assumed the lock needed force. It needed alignment. A misaligned key, forced hard enough, will eventually break off inside the lock, and then no amount of patience will save you. You will need a whole new mechanism, cut from scratch, and far more time than you have before dawn." Hao turned the key over in his hand, marveling at how light, how unremarkable it looked now that the problem was solved. "How did you know to press down rather than push harder sideways?" "I did not know exactly, not at first," the locksmith admitted. "I simply stopped assuming I already knew the answer and let my fingers ask the lock instead of telling it. Every stiff lock has its own particular stubbornness. Some need more weight, some need less. Some need to be lifted rather than pressed. The only way to learn which is to stop forcing your assumption onto the metal and start feeling for what is actually there." "That sounds like it takes a great deal of practice," Hao said. "It takes a great deal of willingness to be wrong about your first guess," the locksmith said. "Practice helps, but willingness comes first. I have seen skilled men ruin good locks because they were too proud to admit, even to themselves, that their first turn of the wrist was not the right one." Hao sat with this for a long moment, turning the key in his fingers, no longer simply an object he had fought with, but something he now understood, just slightly, better than before. "I came here certain the lock was at fault. I am leaving uncertain whether it was the lock at all." "It rarely is," the locksmith said, returning to his tea. "Most stuck locks are not asking us to be stronger. They are asking us to be more honest about what we do not yet know, and curious enough to find out." Before Hao left, he paused at the doorway, key still in hand. "If I bring you every stiff lock I ever meet from now on, will you always find the answer this quickly?" The locksmith shook his head, setting his tea down again with a quiet laugh. "Some locks take me an hour of careful feeling before I find their particular stubbornness. Some I never solve at all and must be replaced entirely, no matter how patient I am. Tonight's lock happened to be a simple one, once someone stopped fighting it long enough to feel it properly. Then how do I know when I meet a stuck lock of my own whether it needs patience or whether it truly is broken beyond saving? You will not always know right away, the locksmith admitted. But you will know this much sooner if you spend your first effort feeling rather than forcing. A lock that is merely misaligned will often tell you so, quietly, under careful fingers, within the first few minutes. A lock that is truly broken will tell you that too, eventually, but only after you have stopped assuming and started listening. The danger is never in trying. The danger is in deciding you already know the answer before you have asked the question. Hu nodded slowly, turning this over as he stepped out into the cold. Feeling before forcing, he repeated, as though testing the words on his tongue. I will try to remember that the next time something will not move for me. You will forget, the locksmith called after him, not unkindly. Everyone does at first, when frustration arrives faster than memory, but the lock will remind you if you let it. They always do. Hu thanked him and carried his strong-box home through the cold night air, the key light in his coat pocket, his wrist no longer aching, his mind turning over the strange and simple truth that the answer had been so small and his assumption had been so large. In the Stoic philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, there is a similar understanding of where our effort belongs. The Stoics drew a careful line between what lies within our control and what does not, and they taught that wasting our strength on the latter is the root of most needless suffering. A lock's inner mechanism, its particular wear and rust and resistance, is not within our control. Our angle, our patience, our willingness to adjust, these are two threads from Stoic teaching deepen this lesson. First, the philosopher Epictetus taught that distress comes not from events themselves, but from our judgments about them. And a key that will not turn is in itself simply a key that will not turn until we attach frustration, urgency, and self-blame to the moment. Second, the Stoics practiced what they called the discipline of action, choosing responses that align with reason and nature rather than with the heat of the moment, much like feeling for the lock's true angle rather than thrashing against its resistance. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private reflections that the obstacle itself can become the way forward if we stop wasting our strength fighting its existence and start studying its shape. The stiff lock, looked at calmly, is not an enemy. It is simply information about where the alignment has not yet been found. You may be holding a key of your own tonight, turning it the same way again and again against something that will not give. Perhaps it is a job application you keep reworking in the exact same format, hoping the fifth attempt will succeed where the first four did not. Perhaps it is an apology you keep phrasing the same way to someone who is not yet ready to hear it, no matter how many times you repeat the same words with more feeling behind them. Notice whether your hand has been pushing in only one direction, certain of the angle, unwilling to consider that the angle itself might be the problem. There is no shame in this. Most of us were taught that persistence means doing the same thing harder, rather than doing a slightly different thing with the same care. You do not need to find the correct angle tonight. You only need to loosen your grip enough to notice that there might be one you have not yet tried. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench, and as you settle here now, let the very idea of forcing anything dissolve for a while, the way a key finally finds its angle the moment a hand stops insisting and starts listening instead. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a particular madness that overtakes us when a drawer jams halfway open. We yank it, we rattle it side to side, we pull so hard the whole cabinet rocks forward on its legs, and still it will not budge, because something inside, a fallen object, a warped runner, a corner caught crosswise, is wedged in a way that no amount of yanking can fix, and may in fact be making worse. Wu Wei asks a strange question in such moments. What if the drawer does not need to be pulled at all, but pushed first, just slightly, to free whatever is binding it? What if the only way forward is, briefly, backward? The grasping mind cannot imagine this. It only knows how to pull toward the goal. But sometimes the goal is reached by first releasing toward what we came from. A scribe named Anjali kept her household ledgers in a heavy wooden cabinet that had belonged to her grandmother. One morning, in a hurry to find a record before the tax assessor arrived, she pulled at the lowest drawer and felt it stop dead after only a finger's width, jammed fast. She pulled again, harder. The whole cabinet groaned and shifted on the floor. She pulled once more, bracing her foot against the cabinet's base for leverage, and still the drawer refused to move another finger's width. Her neighbor, an elderly carpenter's widow named Mira, happened to be passing the open window and paused at the sound of the commotion. "You will tip that cabinet over before that drawer ever opens," Mira said, leaning in through the window with mild amusement. "The assessor arrives within the hour," Anjali said, not looking up. "I need the ledger that is inside this drawer, and it will not open." "May I look?" Mira asked, already letting herself in through the side door without waiting for a reply. She knelt before the cabinet and studied the gap Anjali had managed to create, no wider than a finger, before peering into the dim space above the drawer. "Something has fallen down behind it," Mira said. "Likely a small object, perhaps a button or a bead, lodged between the drawer's back edge and the cabinet's frame. The harder you pull the drawer toward you, the more tightly that object wedges itself into the gap. You are pulling the very mechanism that is jamming you." "Then what should I do? I cannot reach behind it if the drawer will not come out." "You do not need it to come out," Mira said. "You need it to go back in, just slightly, first." Anjali stared at her. "Push it closed? That is the opposite of what I am trying to do." "It is the opposite of what you want," Mira said, with the patient half-smile of someone who has explained this many times before. "But it is not the opposite of what will work. Push the drawer in, gently, no more than the width you already pulled it out. This will loosen whatever is wedged, because the pressure that is jamming it comes from the angle of the pull, not from the object itself sitting still." Anjali, doubtful but desperate, placed both hands on the drawer's edge and pushed it inward instead of pulling. It gave easily, sliding back almost to its original position. "Now," Mira said, Pull again, but slowly this time, and stop the moment you feel any resistance at all. Do not fight the resistance. Simply stop and wiggle the drawer gently side to side, the smallest motion you can manage, before continuing. Anjali did as she was told. The drawer moved an inch, met resistance, and instead of pulling through it, she paused and wiggled it lightly as instructed. Something shifted with a small, almost inaudible click, and the resistance vanished. The drawer slid open the rest of the way without any further effort at all. Anjali sat back on her heels, astonished. It opened on its own, almost. I barely did anything that last time. You did the right thing, which often looks like very little, Meera said. The whole problem was that you believed the drawer was fighting you, so you fought back. But the drawer was never fighting you. Something small and stuck inside it was simply caught at the wrong angle, and your pulling was holding it at exactly that wrong angle again and again. Anjali reached into the drawer and found, lodged in the back corner exactly as Meera had predicted, a small brass button that must have fallen from a garment years before and rolled into the gap unnoticed. All this trouble, she said, holding up the tiny button, from something this small. It is rarely the size of the obstruction that causes the real trouble, Meera said, rising slowly to her feet. It is the direction of the force applied against it. A small thing pulled against again and again can jam as completely as a large one, and a large one, approached at the right angle, can come free as easily as this little button just did. Anjali found her ledger and finished her preparations with time to spare before the assessor's arrival, but what stayed with her longer than the relief of meeting her deadline was the strangeness of the lesson, that the way out this time had begun by going briefly back in. I would never have thought to push it closed, she admitted to Meera as the older woman gathered herself to leave. Every instinct I had said, pull harder. Most instincts say that, Meera replied at the door. It is why so many drawers and so many other things besides stay jammed for far longer than they need to. The instinct to pull harder is not wrong because it is foolish. It is wrong because it assumes the only direction worth trying is the direction of the goal. But how do you know in the moment that pushing inward is the right move and not just another wasted effort? Anjali asked, still turning the small brass button over in her fingers. What if I had pushed it closed and nothing had changed at all? Then I would have told you to try something else, Meera said simply. There is no single trick that frees every jammed thing. What matters is the willingness to stop repeating the same failed motion and try a different one, even if that different motion feels strange or counterproductive at first. That sounds like it requires a great deal of trust, Anjali said. Trust that the strange motion might work, even when every habit in your body says otherwise. It does, Meera agreed, and that trust is not blind. It comes from paying attention to what the stuck thing is actually doing, rather than what you wish it would do. The drawer told you the moment it stopped after a finger's width that something specific was wrong. You only had to be quiet enough to ask what, instead of loud enough to demand it move anyway. Anjali smiled at this, setting the button down on the table beside her ledger. I think I have spent most of my life being loud at stuck things instead of quiet with them. Most of us have, Meera said, stepping toward the door. It is a slow unlearning, and it never quite finishes. But each time you remember to ask instead of demand, the unlearning goes a little deeper. In Hindu philosophy, there is a similar understanding of releasing the grip of the striving self. The concept of nishkama karma, action without attachment to the fruit of that action, teaches that we often sabotage our own efforts by clutching too tightly to a particular outcome in a particular direction at a particular pace. Two threads from this tradition deepen the lesson of the jammed drawer. First, the Bhagavad Gita teaches that the anxious mind fixed only on result becomes a poor instrument for right action, much like Anjali's hands, fixed only on pulling outward, became poor instruments for actually freeing the drawer. Second, there is the teaching of aparigraha, non-grasping, which holds that loosening our hold on an outcome often creates the very space in which the outcome can finally arrive. A well-known verse from the Gita observes that the wise act without being bound to the result, and in that freedom often find the result arrives more completely than it would under desperate effort. The same small lesson the jammed drawer offered Anjali. Perhaps tonight you are holding on to something the way Anjali held the drawer, pulling in only one direction, certain that more force in that single direction is the only path forward. Maybe it is a goal you have been chasing so directly that you have not noticed it slipping further away with every aggressive step you take toward it. Maybe it is a friendship strained by your own eagerness to fix it quickly, where every attempt to pull things back to normal seems to wedge the tension in deeper instead. Consider gently whether there is a small backward step available to you. Not a retreat, not a defeat, but a brief release of pressure that might loosen what your forward pulling has jammed. This could be as simple as setting the goal down for an evening, or saying nothing further in the difficult conversation until it has had time to settle. You do not need to identify the exact button lodged behind the drawer of your life tonight. You only need to notice where you have been pulling and consider, just for now, what it might feel like to push gently the other way instead. Let that thought rest in you as you settle further into the bed beneath you, releasing your grip on the day exactly the way the drawer finally released its grip on its own small obstruction. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A gate hinge rusted in place will not be persuaded by impatience. Slam the gate, and the rust only bites deeper into the metal, fusing what movement remains. There is a quieter approach, one that the urgent mind resists because it seems to do almost nothing. A drop of oil, left to sit, soaking slowly into the seized joint, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply waiting for the metal to remember how to move. Wu Wei honors this slowness, not because slowness is always virtuous, but because some forms of stuckness are corrosion, not obstruction, and corrosion cannot be muscled away. It can only be dissolved patiently from the inside. The rust does not need our anger. It needs our willingness to wait without demanding an immediate result. A monk named Renshu tended the gardens of a small mountain temple, and each morning he passed through a side gate to reach the herb beds beyond the outer wall. One spring morning, after a long, damp winter, the gate's hinge had rusted so completely that the gate would not swing at all, no matter how he heaved against it. A young novice named Daiki, newly arrived at the temple, found Renshu standing before the gate, both hands pressed flat against the wood, leaning his full weight into it without result. "Master Renshu, let me help," Daiki said, and threw his shoulder against the gate alongside him. Together they pushed, and the gate groaned but did not move, the hinge shrieking in protest at the strain. "We are strong enough together," Daiki said, breathless. "If we push harder, surely it will give." Renshu stepped back, wiping his brow, and to Daiki's surprise, he laughed softly. "We could break this gate from its post entirely with enough strength, young one. That is not the same as freeing it. But it is stuck. Something must force it open." "Something must free it," Renshu corrected gently. "Forcing and freeing are not always the same motion, though they can look similar from a distance." He walked to a small shed near the herb beds and returned with a clay vessel of thin golden oil pressed from the temple's own seeds. "Watch," he said, and tipped a slow trickle of oil along the length of the rusted hinge, letting it run into every crevice where the metal had fused. Daiki watched, unimpressed. "That is all? Will it simply open now?" "No," Renshu said. "It will do nothing at all for a while. That is the part most people cannot bear." "Then what was the point of the oil?" "The oil does not force the rust away," Renshu said. "It dissolves it, slowly, from within the joint, in its own time, which is rarely our time. We must learn to be patient with a different kind of patience than the patience of waiting in a line or waiting for water to boil. This is the patience of trusting a process we cannot see and cannot rush." Daiki sat on the low wall nearby, arms crossed. "How long must we wait?" "I do not know exactly," Renshu admitted, settling beside him. "Perhaps the rest of the morning. Perhaps until tomorrow. It depends on how deeply the rust has taken hold, and that is not something I can see from the outside. It feels foolish, sitting here while the gate stands there unmoved," Daiki said. "It only feels foolish because you believe usefulness must look like effort," Renshu said. "But consider, if we had thrown ourselves against that gate for another hour, what would we have gained? A sore shoulder, a strained hinge, perhaps a cracked post, and the gate would still not open properly even then, only brokenly, forced past where it was ready to go." They sat together as the sun rose higher, and Renshu used the quiet hour to teach Daiki the names of the herbs growing nearby, neither of them looking at the gate, though both were aware of it, patient at the edge of their attention. "Do you ever grow frustrated waiting like this?" Daiki finally asked. "Of course," Renshu said. "The frustration arrives in me the same as it arrives in you. I simply do not act on it as quickly as I once did. There is a difference between feeling impatience and being ruled by it. I let the impatience move through me like a small cloud crossing the sky, present, but not in command of my hands." After the better part of the morning had passed, Renshu rose and returned to the gate. He pressed his palm to it, not pushing, only resting, testing for movement the way one might test the temperature of water before stepping in. "Now," he said, and swung the gate. It moved, stiffly at first, with a faint groan, but it moved, swinging open in a slow, complete arc that brought a quiet smile to his weathered face. Daiki stared. It simply opened. After all that waiting, it just opened the way it always should have. It was always going to open this way eventually, Renshu said. The only question was whether we would damage it trying to force the opening before its time, or whether we would let the rust dissolve in its own hour and find the gate sound and whole on the other side of our patience. Daiki helped him gather the empty oil vessel, and as they walked back toward the herb beds together, he asked, "Master, how will I know, the next time something is stuck, whether it needs oil and patience, or whether it truly needs my strength?" Renshu considered this for a long moment before answering. "You will not always know right away, but you can ask yourself this: is the resistance sharp and sudden, like a single object blocking the way? Or is it a slow, all-over stiffness, the kind that has built up over time, unnoticed, until one day it simply will not move? The first kind often needs a clear, decisive action. The second kind, like this hinge, usually needs patience, and the willingness to apply something gentle and let it work quietly beneath the surface for as long as it needs." "And if I am wrong?" Daiki asked. "If I apply patience to something that truly needed force, or force to something that truly needed patience?" "Then you will learn from the wrongness," Renshu said, unbothered. "I have misjudged many sticking points in my years here. I have oiled hinges that needed a stronger hand, and I have forced gates that only needed to be left alone for a season. Neither mistake destroyed me. Each one simply taught me to look a little more closely the next time before deciding which kind of stuckness I was facing." "That sounds like a lifetime of small corrections," Daiki said, somewhat daunted by the prospect. "It is exactly that," Renshu agreed, smiling. "And it is also, I think, the better part of what we call wisdom. Not a single great insight that solves everything forever, but a long collection of small corrections, each one making the next guess slightly more accurate. You are not expected to know this gate's particular stubbornness on your first morning tending it. You are only expected to stay curious enough to keep learning its nature, one rusted hinge at a time." Daiki nodded slowly, the weight of the lesson settling into him with less resistance now than the gate itself had shown. In Buddhist teaching, there is a similar understanding of patience with what cannot be rushed. The practice of shanti, often translated as patience or forbearance, is considered one of the essential virtues on the path, not because patience is passive, but because it requires tremendous inner strength to remain steady while a difficult process unfolds in its own time. Two threads from Buddhist teaching deepen the lesson of the rusted hinge. First, there is the teaching of impermanence, anicca, which reminds us that even deeply stuck conditions are not fixed and eternal. The rust that seems permanent today is itself only a temporary state, already beginning to dissolve the moment the oil reaches it, even before we can see the change. Second, Buddhist teaching speaks often of right effort, samma vayama, which distinguishes between effort that is balanced and sustainable and effort that is forced, anxious, and ultimately self-defeating, much like the difference between Renshu's quiet oil and Daiki's desperate shove. A teaching often shared in Zen lineages describes a student asking a master how long enlightenment takes, and the master answering that it takes exactly as long as it takes, no shorter for the eager and no longer for the patient, only different in how much suffering accompanies the waiting. The hinge, too, asks nothing of us but patience equal to its own slow unwinding. You may have something in your life right now that resembles this rusted hinge more than a single jammed obstacle. Not a sudden block, but a slow accumulated stiffness that has been building for longer than you realized. Perhaps it is a body that has grown tense over months of overwork, resistant now to simply relaxing on command. Perhaps it is a relationship that has slowly stiffened through small, unspoken resentments, none of them severe enough alone to address, but together forming a rust that no single conversation can dissolve in one sitting. Notice whether you have been throwing your shoulder against something that actually needs oil and time instead. There is no failure in applying patience rather than force, only a different kind of action, quieter, less visible, but often far more effective in the end. You do not need to force this stiffness loose tonight. You can simply apply the oil of rest, of breath, of letting go for now, and trust that something is dissolving quietly, even while you cannot see it happening. Let your body settle the way the gate finally settled into easy movement, not because anyone forced it, but because something patient was finally given the time it needed. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A boat grounded on a sandbar presents a peculiar trap. The crew's instinct is to row harder, to drive the hull deeper against the resistance, as though enough strength could simply plow through sand the way it cuts through water. But sand does not yield to force the way water does. The harder the oars dig in, the more firmly the keel settles. There is, instead, a stranger remedy: to wait for the tide. Not to fight the sandbar at all, but to let the rising water itself lift the boat free, accomplishing in patient stillness what no amount of rowing could achieve. Wu Wei recognizes that some stuck places are not asking to be pushed through, but to be waited out until a larger and more patient force does the lifting for us. A fishing crew led by a weathered captain named Orsa ran their small boat onto a hidden sandbar one foggy morning, far from the usual channel markers. The hull shuddered to a stop, and the 4 crew members aboard immediately began to argue over what to do. "Row backward," one shouted. "All together, hard as we can." They tried, oars churning the grey water to foam, and the boat did not move an inch. "Then row forward, push through it," another said, and they tried that too, straining until their arms burned, and still the boat sat fixed in the sand as though it had grown roots there. A young crewman named Petar, newest among them, noticed that Orsa had not joined the rowing at all. She sat at the stern, watching the waterline along the hull with quiet attention. "Captain, why do you not help us row?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. We need everyone's strength if we are to break free. You could put 20 strong backs on those oars, Orsa said, and you would only tire 20 backs instead of 4. The boat is not stuck because it lacks strength against it. It is stuck because the water beneath us has not yet returned. The water is right here, Petar said, gesturing at the grey expanse around them. There is water around the boat, Orsa agreed, but not enough beneath it, not yet. The tide is still low. In an hour, perhaps 2, it will rise, and the very water you are trying to row through will lift this hull free without a single stroke of effort from any of us. The other crewmen, exhausted from their rowing, slumped back against the benches, unconvinced but too tired to argue further. It feels wrong to simply sit here, Petar said, sitting beside Orsa now, as though we are giving up. I understand why it feels that way, Orsa said. We are taught from childhood that stuck things require our strength, that any obstacle worth overcoming must be overcome by our own hands. But the sea does not care what we were taught as children. The sea has its own rhythms, far older and far more patient than our urgency. How do you know the tide will rise in time? What if we sit here for nothing, and the fog grows worse, and night comes before we are freed? I do not know for certain, Orsa admitted. I know the tide tables for these waters, learned from my own teacher many years ago, and learned again through my own years of watching this particular stretch of coast. But certainty is not the same as control. I cannot make the tide rise faster by worrying about it. I can only know, with reasonable confidence, that it will rise, and use the waiting well instead of wasting it in dread. Petar considered this. What do you mean, use the waiting well? Orsa gestured at the nets, coiled and tangled from the morning's earlier work. We can mend the nets while we wait, we can check the lines, we can rest the arms that exhausted themselves on oars that were never going to move us anyway. The waiting does not have to be empty simply because the rowing has stopped. Petar picked up a section of tangled net and began, slowly, to work the knots loose, glancing now and then at the waterline along the hull, watching for the small, almost imperceptible signs that the tide was beginning its return. It is strange, he said after a while. I feel less frantic now than I did when we were rowing, even though nothing has actually changed about our situation. Something has changed, Orsa said. You have stopped fighting the part of the situation that cannot be fought and started tending to the part that can. That shift alone is often the difference between suffering through a wait and simply waiting. The fog began to thin as the morning wore on, and slowly, almost too gradually to notice at first, the water around the hull deepened. Petar felt it before he saw it, a faint lift beneath the boat, a softening of the contact between keel and sand. "Captain," he said, "I think—" "I feel it too," Orsa said, already moving to the oars, calling the others up from their rest. "Now, gently. We do not need to fight any more. We only need to guide her free now that the sea has done the work we could not." With barely any effort at all, the boat lifted clear of the sandbar and slid back into open water, the crew cheering despite their exhaustion, the morning's panic already beginning to feel distant and almost foolish in hindsight. "All that strength we spent rowing against the sand," Petar said as they steered back toward the channel, "and in the end, the tide did in a moment what we could not do in an hour." "That is usually how it goes," Orsa said, smiling at the wheel. The tide was never our enemy, Petar. Our impatience was. The sandbar was simply waiting for us to remember that we were never as alone in this as we feared, that the sea itself was already on its way to help us, if only we would stop fighting long enough to let it arrive. Petar was quiet for a while, watching the fog continue to lift around them. Captain, will it always be this clear? Will I always know the next time something traps me, whether to row or to wait? No, Orsa said honestly. There will be times you must row with everything you have, because the danger will not wait for any tide. A storm closing in, a leak taking on water faster than it can be bailed, those moments call for force, immediately, without hesitation. The skill is not in always choosing patience, it is in learning to tell the two apart. And how do you tell them apart when everyone is shouting and there is no time to think it through calmly? You ask one simple question, Orsa said. Is the danger growing while I wait, or does only my comfort suffer? If the danger grows, act. If only comfort suffers, what you feel is not true urgency, only impatience dressed up to look like it. The sandbar was never going to sink us. It only wounded our pride. Petar turned this over as the boat continued toward the channel, the lesson settling into him alongside the salt air and the relief of open water beneath the hull once more. In Hasidic Jewish teaching, there is a similar understanding of trust in a larger unfolding beyond our immediate control. Many of the great Hasidic masters taught that bitachon, trust in a benevolent order beneath events, allows a person to act with full effort where effort is called for, while releasing the desperate grip on outcomes that belong to a larger rhythm than our own striving. Two threads from this tradition deepen the lesson of the grounded boat. First, there is the teaching, found in stories of the Baal Shem Tov and those who followed him, that hardship often arrives not as punishment, but as a hidden invitation to discover a patience and faith we did not know we carried, much like Orsa's crew discovering, through their stuck boat, a different relationship with waiting itself. Second, Hasidic teaching often speaks of the holiness found in ordinary waiting, the small tasks of daily life, mending nets or sweeping a floor, performed with full presence rather than resentment at the delay. A teaching shared among several Hasidic communities holds that a person should always remember two truths at once: that the whole world was created for their sake, and that they themselves are but dust. Held together, these truths produce neither despair nor reckless overreach, but a grounded patience, the same patience that let Orsa wait for a tide she could not command, but could, in time, trust. You might be sitting tonight on a sandbar of your own making, having rowed hard against something that simply has not reached the right moment yet. Perhaps it is a job search that has stalled despite every application sent, every interview attempted, leaving you wondering what more aggressive effort could possibly change. Perhaps it is grief, or healing from a loss, where you have tried every technique you know to feel better faster, only to find that some sorrows simply need their own tide to rise in their own time. Consider where in your life you have been rowing against sand, exhausting yourself against a resistance that effort alone cannot move. There may be a more patient process already underway beneath the surface of your awareness that simply has not reached the moment of lifting you free. You do not need to know exactly when your tide will rise tonight. You only need to set the oars down for now and tend gently to what is actually within your reach, your breath, your rest, this quiet hour. Let your body settle the way the boat settled once its crew stopped fighting the sand and started trusting the sea. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. When a foot becomes wedged in a narrow crevice of rock, panic suggests one solution. Yank it free immediately with whatever strength remains. But a foot pulled straight back against stone that narrows toward the surface only jams tighter. The way a fish hook sets deeper, the more the line is pulled. The actual way out is almost never the direction panic demands. It is often a small rotation, a slight twist of the ankle, finding the one angle at which the foot was never actually trapped at all, only resting at the wrong orientation. Wu Wei teaches that the way out of a stuck place is rarely the reverse of the way we got stuck. It requires a different motion altogether, one discovered only once the panic quiets enough to feel for it. A young climber named Soren had scrambled up a steep rock face above his village to retrieve a hawk's feather his younger sister wanted, and in reaching for a foothold, wedged his boot deep into a narrow crevice that pinched tighter the higher the rock rose. He pulled back hard, and his boot would not budge. He pulled again, twisting his whole leg, and felt only a tightening grip of stone against his ankle. An old hermit who lived in a small hut partway up the slope, tending a modest garden of mountain herbs, heard the boy's cries and made his way over at an unhurried pace. "Stay still," the hermit said, before Soren had even finished explaining his predicament. "Stay still? I am stuck. I need to pull free before my leg cramps entirely." "Pulling is what trapped you," the hermit said, kneeling beside the crevice to examine the angle of the boot. "This crack narrows as it rises. Your boot slid in at an angle where it fit, and now you are trying to remove it along a path where it does not fit at all. No wonder it will not come." "Then how do I get it out?" Soren's voice cracked with frustration and rising panic. The hermit held up a hand, calm and unbothered by the boy's distress. "First, breathe. Panic tightens the body, and a tight body fits worse in a narrow space than a loose one. Your boot is not only caught by the rock, it is caught further by the tension in your own leg." Soren forced himself to take a slow breath, though his hands still trembled against the stone. "Now," the hermit continued, "do not pull straight back. Feel for the angle your foot entered at and try turning your ankle, just slightly, as though you were trying to find the exact path it slid in along, only in reverse. That makes no sense. The way out should be the way I came, but backward." It is the way you came, but backward in shape, not in direction, the hermit said. Your foot did not slide straight down into this crack. It twisted slightly as it descended, the way water finds the curve of a riverbed rather than cutting straight through stone. If you pull only straight back, you are asking the crack to release you along a path it was never holding you on in the first place. Soren, skeptical but out of other ideas, tried rotating his ankle slowly, feeling for resistance, easing off whenever the rock pinched tighter, continuing only where it seemed to loosen. There, the hermit said quietly, watching closely. Do you feel that give? Just there? A little, Soren admitted, surprised. Follow it, not with force, with attention. Let your ankle find the gap rather than forcing a gap that is not there. Slowly, with small adjustments rather than one decisive pull, Soren felt his boot shift, then shift again, the stone seeming almost to release its grip in small increments rather than all at once. Finally, with a motion so gentle it barely felt like effort at all, his foot slid free. He sat back against the rock, breathing hard, more from the fading adrenaline than from any exertion. I would have pulled on that for another hour and only hurt myself worse. Many do, the hermit said, settling onto a nearby stone with the unhurried air of someone who had all the time in the world. The mind in a panic believes the only honest effort is the effort of pulling against whatever is resisting it. It rarely occurs to the mind in a panic that the resistance has a shape, and that the way through is to match that shape rather than oppose it. How did you know to look for the angle instead of just telling me to pull harder like everyone else would have? The hermit smiled, the lines of his weathered face deepening. I was once stuck in a crevice myself many years ago, much like you, though I was a grown man by then and ought to have known better. I pulled until my ankle swelled to twice its size, and still I was trapped. It was a traveling healer passing through these mountains who finally showed me what I'm showing you now. I have never forgotten the strange relief of discovering that the way out was not the opposite of the way in, but a variation of it. A variation, Soren repeated, turning the word over as he rubbed his sore ankle. Most stuck places are like that, the hermit said. We assume the way out must directly oppose the way we got stuck, pull where we were pushed, retreat where we advanced. But the truth is usually more particular than that. Each stuck place has its own exact shape, and the way free is found only by feeling for that shape, not by assuming we already know it before we have even looked closely. Soren stood slowly, testing his ankle, grateful to find it sore but whole. Thank you. I came up here for a feather, and I am leaving with something else entirely. The feather is still up there if you still want it, the hermit said, nodding toward the ledge above. Though perhaps you will climb toward it a little more carefully this time, feeling for the shape of the rock instead of assuming you already know it. Before he climbed on, Soren turned back once more. What if I had panicked the whole time? Then I would have gone for rope and other hands to pull you free by cruder means, the hermit said. There is no shame in needing help when the gentle way is beyond you. I tell you of the angle because it is often available, not because it is always available. So the lesson is not that force is always wrong, Soren said slowly. No, the hermit agreed. The lesson is that force is not the only tool, and very often not the first one worth reaching for. A wise climber carries both kinds of strength, the strength to pull hard when pulling is truly needed, and the quieter strength to pause and feel for the shape of the problem before assuming pulling is the answer at all. Soren nodded, turning to face the slope above him with a steadier breath than before, and continued up the rock with new caution. The crevice's strange lesson settled quietly into his legs alongside the fading ache. In Japanese Zen tradition, there is a similar understanding of meeting resistance through attentive presence rather than blunt force. The concept of mushin, often described as a mind without obstruction, points toward a state in which the practitioner responds to what is actually happening, moment by moment, rather than to a fixed plan formed in advance and clung to regardless of circumstance. Two threads from Zen practice deepen the lesson of the wedged foot. First, there is the teaching, common in swordsmanship and other Zen-influenced arts, that the tense, gripping mind reacts a half-moment too late, while the relaxed, attentive mind responds exactly in time, much as Soren's panicked pulling worked against him until his breath slowed enough to let his ankle actually feel the rock. Second, Zen teaching often emphasizes shoshin, the beginner's mind, approaching even a familiar difficulty as though encountering it freshly, without the assumption that we already know the one correct response before we have looked closely at what is actually in front of us. A well-known Zen story tells of a swordsman who defeats opponents not through greater strength, but through a stillness so complete that he senses the precise shape of an attack before reacting to it at all. The crevice in the rock, too, has its own shape, knowable only to the climber willing to grow quiet enough to feel it. You may have something tonight that feels, in its own way, like a foot wedged in stone. A problem you keep trying to solve by retracing your exact steps backward, assuming the way out must mirror the way in. Perhaps it is a misunderstanding with a colleague, where you keep trying to explain yourself the same way you originally explained the situation, not realizing the explanation itself may need an entirely different shape. Perhaps it is a habit you are trying to break by simply willing yourself to stop, the same direct opposition that has never worked before. Notice whether you have been pulling straight back against something that needs, instead, a small twist, a different angle, a willingness to feel for the actual shape of what is holding you rather than assuming you already know it. You do not need to find that angle tonight. You only need to let your breath slow enough that, when the moment comes, your attention will be loose enough to feel for it. And as you rest here now, let your own body untangle the way Soren's ankle finally did. Not through force, but through a quiet, curious attention to its own particular shape. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A jar lid sealed too tight defeats even strong hands, not because the hands lack strength, but because gripping harder only makes the fingers slip rather than turn. There is a vacuum at work beneath the surface, an invisible pressure holding the lid down with a force no amount of twisting alone can overcome. The solution is rarely more grip. It is releasing the seal itself. A tap against the rim, a moment of warmth, a small disruption that changes the pressure rather than fighting it directly. Wu Wei recognizes that some resistance is not mechanical but pressurized, invisible, holding firm precisely because we keep attacking its visible surface while ignoring the unseen force beneath it. Address what is actually holding the lid down, and the turning becomes almost unnecessary. A healer's apprentice named Brig had prepared a salve for a sick child in her village, sealing it carefully into a clay jar for the journey across the glen. By the time she arrived, the lid had sealed itself so tightly that no amount of twisting could budge it, her palms slipping uselessly against the smooth clay rim. The child's grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman named Aini, who had buried 3 husbands and raised more children than she could easily count, watched Briggs struggle for a few minutes before speaking. "You will only bruise your hands that way," Aini said. "I have tried every grip I know," Bry said, exasperated. "Cloth around the lid for traction, my whole body weight against the jar braced on the floor, nothing turns it even slightly. That is because the lid is not stuck to the jar the way a cork is stuck in a bottle," Aini said. "It is held down by the air itself, sealed tight when the salve cooled inside. You are fighting a force you cannot even see, with a grip meant only for forces you can." Bry frowned at the jar. "How do you fight a force you cannot see? You do not fight it directly," Aini said. "You change it. Bring the jar near the fire, not to heat the salve, only to warm the lid slightly more than the contents beneath it. The metal expands faster than the clay it sits against, and that small difference is often enough to break the seal without any twisting at all." Bry held the jar near the hearth's edge, turning it slowly, patient despite her worry for the waiting child. After a few minutes, Aini took it from her hands and, instead of twisting immediately, wrapped the edge of the lid firmly but gently against the stone hearth, all the way around its rim. "What does that do?" Bry asked. "It disturbs the seal, just slightly, in many small places rather than one large one," Aini said. "A seal that is whole all the way around is very strong. A seal disturbed in even a few small spots loses much of its strength all at once, the way a wall with many small cracks falls more easily than a wall with one large dent." She handed the jar back to Bry. "Now try." Bry gripped the lid again, expecting the same fruitless slipping as before, and felt it give almost immediately, turning with a soft hiss of released pressure. "It worked," she said, startled. "I barely had to try at all that time." "You did try," Aini said. "You simply tried at the right target instead of the wrong one. All your earlier effort was aimed at the grip between your hand and the lid. The actual obstacle was never there. It was the seal beneath, the invisible pressure holding everything in place." Bry hurried the salve inside to the waiting child, and once the worst of the urgency had passed, she returned to sit with Aini by the hearth, still turning the lesson over. "How did you know about the warmth and the tapping?" she asked. "Is this something the healers taught you?" Aini shook her head, smiling faintly at the memory. "No healer taught me this. My grandmother taught me over jars of preserved fruit many winters ago. I struggled exactly as you did, certain that strength alone should be enough for any stuck lid, until she showed me that some problems are not problems of strength at all. It is strange, Bry said. I came here today thinking only of the child's illness, and I am leaving having learned something about jars. The lesson rarely announces itself as the lesson you needed, Aini said. It simply arrives disguised as whatever stands in front of you that day, whether it is a sick child or a stubborn lid. You only need to be willing to notice it when it shows up sideways like that. Will it always be this way? Bry asked. Will every stuck thing have some invisible pressure I need to find, the way this lid did? Not every stuck thing, Aini said. Some things truly are stuck only on the surface, and a firmer grip is exactly what they need. But I have learned to ask the question before assuming the answer. Is there something beneath this resistance that I cannot see, holding it in place more firmly than the visible surface suggests? More often than you would think, the answer is yes, and the moment you find that hidden pressure, the visible struggle nearly solves itself. What if the warmth alone is not enough? Bry asked, still curious despite the late hour. What if the seal is too strong, even for that? Then there are other ways to ease a seal, Aini said. Sometimes a thin blade slipped just beneath the lid's edge, gently, can let a whisper of air in without forcing anything. Sometimes turning the jar upside down for a moment changes the pressure enough on its own. There is rarely only one way to release what is held by an unseen force. There are many small doors if you are willing to look for them instead of insisting on the one you already tried. How do you choose which door to try first? I start with whichever seems gentlest and least likely to break the jar, Aini said. Warmth before blades, patience before urgency. If the gentle door does not open, I try the next gentlest, and the next only reaching for force as the very last resort, when every gentler door has truly failed and not merely been impatiently abandoned. That sounds like it requires more thought than simply gripping harder, Bry said. It requires a different kind of thought, Aini agreed. Gripping harder requires no thought at all, only frustration. Finding the gentle door requires you to actually look at what is in front of you, rather than at what you wish were in front of you. That is a harder habit to build, but a far more useful one, in jars and in nearly everything else. Bry nodded, glancing once more at the jar, now empty and harmless on the table between them, its earlier stubbornness already forgotten by everyone but her. In Celtic wisdom, there is a similar understanding of the unseen forces shaping visible events. Many old Celtic traditions held that the world we can touch and measure is only one layer of a deeper reality, and that the wise person learns to sense the hidden currents beneath ordinary appearances rather than treating only the surface as real. Two threads from this tradition deepen the lesson of the sealed jar. First, there is the old reverence for thresholds, the belief that certain moments and places hold a pressure or charge not visible to careless eyes, and that approaching them with respect and attentiveness yields far more than approaching them with force or haste. Second, Celtic storytelling often features wise women and hedge healers, figures much like Aine, who hold practical knowledge passed down through generations, precisely because it addresses causes the untrained eye cannot see, knowledge earned through long familiarity rather than brute persistence. An old saying from this tradition holds that the well runs deepest where the surface looks calmest, suggesting that what appears still and simple from above often hides a far more complex truth beneath. The jar's stubborn lid, sealed by an invisible pressure no eye could see, tells the same old story in its own small kitchen table way. Perhaps tonight you have been gripping at something the same way Bry gripped the lid, applying more strength to a visible surface while an invisible pressure holds the real resistance underneath. Maybe it is an argument with a partner that keeps resurfacing in slightly different forms, each time addressed only at the surface level of whatever was just said, never touching the older, unspoken pressure feeding it from beneath. Maybe it is your own body's resistance to rest, where you keep trying to force sleep through sheer willpower, while an unaddressed worry quietly holds the real seal in place. Consider gently whether there is something unseen beneath your current stuck place, something that more grip and more force will never reach, no matter how strong your hands become. You do not need to identify the exact hidden pressure tonight. You only need to soften your grip enough to wonder whether it exists at all. Notice, too, that there is rarely only one gentle door available to you, just as Aine described: warmth before blades, patience before urgency. If one small kindness toward yourself does not loosen the seal, there will be another worth trying tomorrow, and you do not need to find it tonight. Let your shoulders loosen, the way the jar's lid loosened the moment someone stopped twisting and started warming. And let sleep arrive the same gentle way, not forced open by your effort, but released quietly once whatever invisible pressure has been holding it shut finally lets go. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A plough caught on a buried root brings the strongest ox to a standstill, no matter how the farmer cracks the rope or shouts encouragement. The root does not care about effort. It cares only about the angle of the blade against it, hidden beneath soil that gives no warning of what lies underneath. Driving the ox harder against an unseen obstacle only strains the harness and exhausts the animal, accomplishing nothing but damage. The wiser response is to stop entirely, kneel down, and dig with bare hands to find what is actually blocking the way. Wu Wei suggests that some stuck places cannot be solved from where we are standing. They require us to come down to a different level entirely, to see with our hands what our eyes from a distance cannot. A farmer named Kofi was ploughing a new field at the edge of his village, his ox straining ahead of him when the plough's blade caught fast on something beneath the soil and would not move another step, no matter how he urged the animal forward. He cracked the rope gently against the ox's flank, calling out encouragement, and the great animal leaned its full weight into the harness, the leather straps creaking with strain. Still, the plough held fast, immovable, the ox's hooves digging furrows of their own in the soft earth from the effort. An elder from the village, a woman named Adwa, who had farmed this same valley for longer than anyone could remember, was walking the field's edge when she noticed Kofi's struggle and came to stand beside him. "Stop urging the ox," she said simply. "But the field must be ploughed before the rains come," Kofi said, breathless from his own straining alongside the animal. "If I cannot move forward, I will fall behind the whole village's planting." "You are not falling behind by stopping for a moment," Adwa said. "You will fall further behind if you injure your ox forcing it against something it cannot move. Come, kneel with me." Kofi, reluctant but trusting her years of experience, joined her on his knees beside the stuck blade, brushing away soil with his hands until they found it, a thick root, old and gnarled, buried just beneath the surface, running directly across the path the plough had been cutting. "There," Adwa said. "This is what your ox has been fighting, and your ox could not see it any more than you could from where you stood behind the handles. What do we do? Cut through it?" "Perhaps," Adwa said, "or perhaps we simply guide the blade around it this once and mark this spot for later, when we have proper tools to remove the root entirely without harming the field around it. Tell me, Kofi, did you feel the plough catch suddenly, or did it resist gradually the closer you came to this spot?" Kofi thought back. "Gradually, I think. The ground grew firmer for several steps before it finally stopped entirely. Then the root runs at an angle beneath the soil, not straight across," Adwa said, tracing the path with her finger in the dirt. "If we had kept driving the ox forward, we would have struck the thickest part of the root directly and likely snapped the plough's blade against it. But if we shift the line just slightly here," she indicated a spot a hand's width to the left, "we may find the root thins enough to let the blade pass beneath it without striking it at all." Kofi looked at her, astonished. "You knew all this simply from how the plough had been moving before it stopped?" "I did not know it with certainty," Adwa admitted. "I guessed it, based on many years of watching ploughs catch on many roots. The certainty came only once we knelt down and felt for the root with our own hands. Guessing from a distance and confirming up close are two different things, and both were needed here." They repositioned the ox and the plough according to Adwa's instruction, and this time, when Kofi urged the animal forward, the blade slid past the buried obstruction with only the faintest scrape, continuing on through the soft soil beyond it as though the root had never been there at all. Kofi stood in the freshly turned furrow, looking back at the spot where he had struggled for so long against an enemy he never even saw. All that strain, and the answer was simply to look more closely at what was actually in the way. "It is almost always simply that," Adwa said. "We stand at a distance from our troubles, urging more effort from ourselves or from those who help us, when the real solution requires getting closer, not pushing harder. The view from where you stood behind the plough handles could never have shown you that route. Only kneeling down could show you that. Will you mark this spot so we remember to remove the root properly before next season?" Kofi asked. "I will mark it," Adwa said, already reaching for a stake to drive into the soil beside the buried obstruction. "And I will tell you something else worth remembering. This field belongs to no single farmer, no matter whose ox ploughs it this season. What we learn here today about this root, about this soil, we owe to whoever ploughs this field after us. That is not generosity exactly. It is simply how a community survives its own fields by passing forward what each of us learns at the cost of our own struggle, so the next person struggles a little less. Kofi nodded slowly, watching her drive the stake firmly into the ground. I came here today only thinking of my own planting. I am leaving thinking of the whole village's planting. That is usually how the deepest lessons arrive, Adwoa said, brushing the soil from her hands. They begin as a private trouble, and they end as something we are glad to have learned on behalf of everyone who comes after us. Adwoa, Kofi said, as they walked the ox toward the next stretch of unploughed field. Do you ever grow tired of kneeling down for other people's roots? You have farmed this valley longer than I have been alive. Surely you have earned the right to simply tell us the answers without all this kneeling. Adwoa laughed, a warm sound that startled a bird from the nearby hedge. I could tell you the answer without kneeling sometimes, but then you would only know that this particular root sits in this particular spot. You would not know how to feel for the next root in the next field that I have never seen and cannot warn you about in advance. The kneeling is not only how we solve today's problem, it is how you learn to solve tomorrow's problem without me. So you kneel beside me not because you need to, but because I need to learn it. Both are true, Adwoa said. I still learn something new each time I kneel. But mostly I kneel so that one day, when I am no longer walking these fields, you will already know how to kneel without me. Kofi was quiet, the weight of this settling into him alongside the easy rhythm of the ox's renewed steps. Then I will try to remember to kneel. The next time something will not move, instead of only straining harder against it. That is all any of us can do, Adwoa said. Remember, and then forget, and then remember again, until the remembering finally outlasts the forgetting. In African Ubuntu philosophy, there is a similar understanding of interconnection and shared learning. The phrase, often rendered as "I am because we are," speaks to a worldview in which a person's well-being, knowledge, and even their stuck places are never fully separate from the community around them. Two threads from Ubuntu philosophy deepen the lesson of the buried root. First, there is the understanding that wisdom gained through one person's struggle is meant to be shared forward, not hoarded as private advantage. Much as Adwoa marked the route not for her own benefit, but for whoever would plough that field next. Second, Ubuntu teaching emphasizes that no individual struggle is ever entirely isolated, that the elder kneeling beside the younger farmer is itself an expression of the community's deeper nature, where strength is found not in solitary effort, but in the willingness to kneel down together and look more closely at a shared difficulty. A common Ubuntu teaching holds that a person who is harsh, selfish, or who acts without regard for others lacks Ubuntu, while a person who shares what they know, who helps another see what they could not see alone, embodies it fully. The buried root, found only because two people knelt down together rather than one person straining alone, tells this same story in the language of soil and harness. You may have a buried root of your own tonight, an obstacle you have been straining against without ever getting close enough to see its shape. Perhaps it is a recurring argument at home that you keep approaching the same way, urging harder for resolution, without ever kneeling down to ask what unspoken root runs beneath every fight. Perhaps it is a creative project stalling at the exact same point, never examined up close. Consider gently whether your stuck place might need less straining and more kneeling, and whether someone in your life has walked this field before who could kneel down beside you and help you see what you cannot see alone. You do not need to find the root tonight. You only need to set down the rope for now and rest, trusting that closer examination, perhaps even shared with someone else, will reveal what straining alone never could. Let your body settle the way the field settled, once the plough finally found its way around what it could not move through. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A tangled fishing net, pulled at random from any loop that presents itself, only tightens its own confusion. Each hurried yank cinches some other part of the mesh until what began as a simple snarl becomes an impossible knot of crossing cords. There is a different way to face such tangles, to spread the whole net out, to see its full shape at once, rather than attacking the first knot that catches the eye, and to follow each cord patiently to where it actually leads. Wu Wei suggests that some confusion cannot be solved piece by piece under pressure. It must first be laid out fully, seen whole, before the patient unwinding can even begin. The net does not ask for speed, it asks for sight. A fisherman's daughter named Tepora had taken her father's net out alone for the first time, eager to prove herself capable before the next great voyage to the outer reef. By the time she returned to shore, the net had tangled itself terribly in the boat's hold, twisted around itself in a way that no amount of pulling at any single cord seemed to improve. She worked at it frantically as the sun began to set, pulling at whichever loop seemed loosest and watching in dismay as each pull only tightened some other section she had not even noticed before. Her grandmother, a woman named Hina, who had once sailed long voyages between islands using nothing but the stars, the swells, and the flight patterns of birds to find her way, came down to the shore and sat beside the tangled net without offering to help immediately. "You are pulling at whatever you can reach first," Hina observed. "I am trying to free it before dark," Tepora said, not looking up. "Father will need this net at dawn." "And has pulling at whatever you can reach first made any real progress?" Tepora paused, examining the net honestly for the first time since she had started. "No. If anything, it looks worse than when I began. That is because you are solving the net the way a person solves a single knot, one piece at a time, without ever seeing the whole shape of the problem," Hina said. "When I was young, learning to find my way across open ocean without any instrument but my own senses, my own grandmother taught me something I have never forgotten. She said that the navigator who stares only at the next wave will lose the larger swell pattern that the whole journey depends on. You must see the whole sea, even while attending to the nearest wave." "What does that have to do with a tangled net?" "Everything," Hina said, rising and gesturing for Tepora to help her lift the entire net out of the boat's hold and spread it fully across the sand, every section visible at once in the fading light. Now, do not touch a single cord yet. Only look. Where does the worst of the tangle actually sit? Tapora studied the spread net for a long moment, something in her shifting from frantic to curious. There, she said finally, pointing to a dense knot near the net's center. Everything else seems to radiate outward from that one spot. Good. Now look further. Which cords lead into that knot from a direction that has slack remaining, and which lead in already taut? Tapora traced the lines slowly with her eyes, no longer reaching to pull at anything. This one here has some give, and this one on the far side. Begin there, Hina said. Not at the center, not yet. Begin at the cords with slack remaining, and follow each one only as far as the give allows. Do not force a single strand past the point where it resists. Tapora knelt and began, carefully now, easing the slack cords through their loops one at a time, stopping the moment any resistance appeared, moving to a different cord rather than forcing the one in her hands. "This is slower than just pulling," she said after a while. "It is slower at first," Hina agreed. "But notice, is it actually working where the pulling was not?" Tapora looked down and realized with some surprise that the dense central knot had already begun to loosen, simply from the patient unwinding of its surrounding cords, without her having touched it directly at all. "It is loosening on its own," she said. "I have not even gone near the worst part yet." "That is usually how it goes," Hina said, settling onto the sand to watch. "The worst-looking knot in any tangle is rarely the place to begin. It is simply where all the tension from the rest of the tangle has gathered. Free the tension around it patiently from wherever there is slack to be found, and the worst knot often unravels almost by itself, with barely any direct effort needed." Tapora continued working as the stars began to appear overhead, and her grandmother named some of them quietly as they emerged, the way she must have once named them on long voyages between distant shores. "Grandmother," Tapora said, pausing in her work, "when you were navigating, lost between islands with nothing to guide you but the sea and the sky, did you ever feel as tangled as this net?" "Many times," Hina said. "The open ocean offers no straight lines, no clear markers, nothing but patterns within patterns, easy to mistake for chaos if you are frightened and searching for a single answer rather than the whole shape of the journey. How did you find your way then?" "The same way you are finding your way through this net," Hina said. "I learned to hold the whole pattern in mind at once, the swell beneath the boat, the wind on my skin, the stars overhead, the flight of birds at dusk, rather than fixing on any single sign and demanding it tell me everything. No one sign was ever the whole answer. The whole answer was always the pattern, all of them made together, seen patiently over time." "Grandmother," Tapora said again near the end of her work, "will I always need someone beside me the way you have tonight? Or will I learn to see it myself?" "You will learn to see it yourself," Hina said, "but only by being shown again and again. The habit I am teaching you is not really about nets. It is about trusting a wider, slower looking before you trust your hands to act." By the time the net lay fully untangled across the sand, smooth and ready for the morning's voyage, the moon had risen high above the water, and Tapora sat back, exhausted but strangely peaceful, in a way the earlier frantic pulling had never once allowed her to feel. In Polynesian wayfinding tradition, there is a similar understanding of seeing the whole pattern rather than fixing on a single point. Traditional navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments, relying instead on a holistic reading of swells, stars, clouds, and bird flight, holding many signs in mind at once rather than depending on any single measurement. Two threads from this tradition deepen the lesson of the tangled net. First, master navigators describe a mental technique sometimes called holding the whole sky and sea in the body, where the navigator does not stare fixedly at the horizon, but maintains a relaxed, full awareness of the entire surrounding pattern, much as Hina taught Tepora to see the whole net before touching any single chord. Second, this tradition emphasizes patient apprenticeship, where knowledge is passed down across generations through years of guided practice rather than sudden mastery, each navigator learning to trust the pattern only after long, unhurried exposure to it. A teaching passed down among Pacific navigating families holds that the canoe that tries to fight every wave individually will exhaust its crew long before reaching land, while the canoe that reads the larger pattern of the swells will find again and again that the sea itself reveals a way through. The tangled net, read as a whole rather than fought thread by thread, offers the same quiet lesson on dry sand. Tonight, you may be holding something that feels every bit as tangled as Tepora's net. A long list of overdue tasks where you keep grabbing whichever one is nearest, only to find the whole pile somehow more snarled afterward. Perhaps it is a family situation involving several people's feelings at once, where addressing one person's hurt seems to tighten another's, no matter which thread you pull first. Consider gently what it might feel like to spread the whole situation out before you, just for a moment, rather than reaching frantically for whatever knot looks most urgent. There may be a looser thread somewhere at the edges, something with a little give in it that would be wiser to begin with than the dense, frightening knot at the center. You do not need to untangle everything tonight. You only need to imagine for a moment the whole pattern laid out calmly before you, the way Tepora finally saw her net once she stopped pulling and started looking. Let your mind rest in that wider view now, the way a navigator rests in the whole sky rather than straining at a single star, and let sleep find you the same patient way. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A millstone that will not turn presents a peculiar test of will. The miller leans into the great wooden lever with all his weight, certain that one more push will start the heavy stone moving, and the stone simply does not move, indifferent to effort entirely. Sometimes the trouble is not in the stone at all, but in what has gathered, unseen, beneath it. Grain dust packed too densely, a small stone wedged where the axle turns, debris invisible from above. Wu Wei asks us to consider that the largest, heaviest, most immovable seeming obstacles are often kept in place by something small enough to overlook entirely. Clearing the small thing rather than straining against the large one, is sometimes the whole of the answer. Clearing the small thing, rather than straining against the large one, is sometimes the whole of the answer. A young miller named Yindi inherited his father's grain mill at the edge of a dry plain, and one harvest morning the great stone wheel that ground the village's grain refused to turn at all, no matter how he and his two younger brothers leaned together against the wooden lever. They strained until their backs ached, certain that their combined strength should be more than enough to start a stone that had turned smoothly every season before. Still it held fast, as though rooted to the earth itself. An old storyteller of the village, a man named Birong, who carried the song lines of the region in memory the way others might carry a map on paper, came to watch the brothers struggle, leaning on his walking stick with patient amusement. "You push the stone as though it has offended you," Birong said. Yindi, sweating and frustrated, straightened up. "It has offended me. It has never refused to turn before, and now, on the very morning we need it most, it will not move at all." "Has it occurred to you," Birong said, "that the stone is not the one refusing? Stones do not refuse. They are simply heavy, and they go where the ground beneath them allows. Then what is stopping it?" "That you cannot know from where you stand pushing," Birong said. "You can only know it by going down beneath the stone where the axle meets the ground and looking at what is actually there." The brothers exchanged uncertain glances, but they did as he suggested, clearing away the loose straw at the base of the mill house until they could see the axle where it disappeared into its stone housing. "There," Yindi said, pointing. A small, hard pebble, no larger than a fingernail, had worked its way into the gap between the axle and its housing, wedging the entire mechanism in place. "That tiny thing," his younger brother said in disbelief, "has stopped all three of us pushing with everything we have?" "It is not such a strange thing," Birong said, settling onto a nearby stump to watch. "I have walked the song lines of this country since I was a boy younger than you, learning the stories that mark every waterhole, every ridge, every crossing place across vast distances of land that would seem featureless to anyone who did not know how to read them. And I have learned this: the smallest marker, easily missed by a careless eye, often holds the key to the whole journey. Miss the small marker, and the largest landmarks in the world will not help you find your way." "What does that have to do with our millstone?" Yindi asked, working carefully to dislodge the wedged pebble with the tip of a thin blade. "Everything," Birong said. "You were looking at the largest, most obvious thing, the great stone itself, heavy and stubborn, and assuming the solution must match its size. But the solution was small, hidden, easy to overlook precisely because it did not look important enough to be the cause of something so large." The pebble came free with a small, almost anticlimactic click, and Windy pressed his palm against the lever once more, expecting another long struggle. Instead, the stone turned easily, almost eagerly, as though grateful to finally move after its long enforced stillness. "All that strength, wasted on the wrong target," Yindi's brother said, shaking his head. "Not wasted exactly," Birong said. "You learned something today that effort alone cannot teach quickly, that the size of a problem and the size of its solution are not always related. I have seen travelers exhaust themselves searching the horizon for a landmark that was small enough to be hiding at their very feet the entire time. Yindi sat beside the old storyteller as the millstone began its steady grinding once more, grain pouring slowly between the great turning surfaces. Birong, how do you know to look down beneath the obvious obstacle, rather than at the obstacle itself? It seems like a strange instinct to trust. It is not an instinct I was born with, Birong admitted. It is a habit built from many years of being wrong in the other direction first. I have stood before stuck things my whole life and assumed, the way you did this morning, that bigger trouble requires bigger force. I have been corrected by small pebbles more times than I care to count. Eventually, the correction becomes a kind of wisdom if you're willing to keep being corrected without growing too proud to notice the pattern. And if I forget this lesson the next time something is stuck? Yindi asked, watching the grain stream steadily downward. You will forget, Birong said simply. Everyone forgets, faced with a heavy, stubborn thing and an urgent need to move it. That is precisely why the songlines exist. Not because any one of us remembers everything alone, but because the stories are walked and told and walked again, generation after generation, until what one person forgets, the story itself remembers on their behalf. Birong, Yindi's younger brother said, still turning the pebble over in his palm, if something this small can stop something this large, how will we ever trust that anything large is actually solved? Could there always be another small pebble hiding somewhere we have not yet looked? Birong chuckled at this, not unkindly. There could be. That is simply the nature of things. But notice, once you cleared this pebble, the stone turned. You did not need to search every possible hiding place in advance, worrying over pebbles that might or might not exist. You only needed to look closely at the one obstacle actually in front of you, in the place where the stone was actually resting. So we should not worry about every possible small thing that could ever go wrong. No, Birong agreed. Worry is its own kind of straining against the lever, except now the lever is your own mind instead of a piece of wood. The lesson is not to fear every hidden pebble in the world. The lesson is to trust that, when something stops, the cause is usually findable, usually small, and usually close at hand, if you are willing to look calmly instead of pushing blindly. Yindi considered this as he watched the grain stream steadily through the turning stone. That's a strange kind of comfort, he said, trusting that the answer is small and close, instead of large and far away. It is the only kind of comfort that has ever proven reliable to me, Birong said, rising slowly from the stump with the help of his walking stick. The large, far-away answers are mostly stories we tell ourselves when we are too frightened or too proud to look down at our own feet. Yindi nodded slowly, watching the small pebble where it had been set aside on a flat stone, strange now in its smallness against the memory of how completely it had stopped them all. In Aboriginal Australian tradition, there is a similar understanding carried through songlines, the pathways of story and memory that mark the land across vast distances. These song cycles encode not only physical landmarks, but also a deeper way of attending closely to small details, since the smallest marker, easily missed, often determines whether a traveler finds water, safety, or is lost entirely. Two threads from this tradition deepen the lesson of the wedged pebble. First, songlines teach a relationship between scale and significance that runs counter to ordinary assumption. A small, unremarkable rock formation or a particular bend in a dry creek bed can hold more importance for survival than a towering, obvious landmark visible for miles. Second, this tradition emphasizes that knowledge survives not through any single person's memory, but through repeated telling and walking across generations, much as Berong described the songlines, remembering what any one person might forget. A teaching shared among custodians of this tradition holds that country itself teaches those who listen closely enough, and that the land's smallest details are never truly hidden, only overlooked by those moving too quickly to notice them. The millstone, stopped entirely by something smaller than a fingernail, offers its own small lesson in the same old wisdom. You may have your own millstone tonight, something heavy that has stopped moving entirely, and you have been straining against its full size, assuming the solution must match your frustration. Perhaps it is a household budget that will not balance, when the actual obstacle is one small recurring expense overlooked entirely. Perhaps it is a long stretch of feeling low, and the true wedge is something as small as too little water or daylight, or one unresolved worry you have not let yourself name. Consider gently whether the size of your current stuckness might be misleading you about the size of its actual cause. You do not need to find that small thing tonight. You only need to wonder whether it might exist, and let that wondering soften the strain in your shoulders. Let your body settle now the way the millstone finally settled into its smooth, familiar turning, once the smallest, most overlooked obstacle was finally found and gently cleared away. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A child's hand caught inside a narrow jar opening teaches a lesson that no amount of explaining can rush. The fist, closed tightly around whatever treasure was reached for inside, will not pass back through the same opening it slipped through so easily before. Every adult instinct is to pull the small arm free by force, and every such pull only tightens the panic and the grip alike. The only true release comes from within, the small hand itself, choosing on its own to let go of what it is holding. Wu Wei recognizes that some stuck places cannot be freed from outside at all. They require an inner release that no external force, however well-intentioned, can substitute for or hurry along. A potter's young daughter named Itzel, no older than 5 summers, reached deep into a tall storage jar to retrieve a smooth painted stone her older cousin had hidden inside as a game, and her small fist closed eagerly around it. When she tried to pull her arm back out, her closed fist would not pass through the narrow neck of the jar that her open hand had slipped through so easily moments before. She began to cry, tugging at her trapped arm, and her mother came running at the sound, immediately gripping the jar with one hand and Itzel's small shoulder with the other, pulling gently at first, and then with increasing urgency as the girl's panic rose. "It will not come out," the mother said, frustration building in her own voice now. "Her arm is stuck fast." A neighboring elder, a calendar keeper named Chak, who studied the long cycles of time and season for the village, happened to be passing and paused at the sound of the commotion. "Stop pulling," Chak said, with such calm certainty that the mother actually paused despite her fear. "She is stuck. Someone must pull her free." "No one needs to pull her free," Chak said, kneeling down to Itzel's level, meeting her tear-streaked face with a gentle, unhurried expression. "She only needs to let go of what she is holding." The mother looked confused. "Let go of what? Her hand is simply too large to fit back through." "Her hand is not too large," Chak said. "Her fist is too large. An open hand fits through that opening as easily as it went in. A closed fist, gripping something tightly, does not. The jar has not changed shape since she reached inside it. Only her hand has changed shape by closing around the stone." Chak turned to Itzel directly, ignoring the jar entirely for a moment. "What is it you are holding so tightly in there, little one?" Through her tears, Itzel managed to say, "The painted stone. My cousin hid it. I do not want to lose it again." "You will not lose it," Chak said gently. "I promise you this, but right now your hand cannot come out while it is wrapped so tightly around the stone. The jar is not your enemy here, your grip is what is holding you." "But if I let go, I will lose it," Itzel said, her small fingers still curled stubbornly tight around her treasure. "You will not lose it," Chak repeated patiently. "The stone cannot leave the jar any faster than your hand can. If you open your fingers just for a moment, the stone will simply rest at the bottom of the jar, exactly where it is now, waiting for you. Then your hand, now open and small again, can slip free through the opening. And once your hand is free, we can simply tip the jar over together, and the stone will roll right out into your open palms, safe and yours, the same as it always was." Itzel considered this through her fading tears, the simple promise settling something in her small, frightened body. Slowly, hesitantly, she let her fingers uncurl inside the jar. "There," Chak said softly. "Now, gently, pull your hand back, small and open, just the way it went in." Itzel's hand slipped free at once, smooth and easy, exactly as it had entered. She stared at her own empty palm in astonishment, then at the jar, still holding her stone safely inside. "It is still in there," she said, wonder replacing fear in her voice. "Of course it is," Chak said, smiling now for the first time. "It was never going anywhere. It was only your fear of losing it that made your hand grip so tightly it trapped itself." The mother, watching this unfold, let out a long breath of relief, and then looked at Chak with something between embarrassment and curiosity. "I would have kept pulling at her arm for an hour, hurting her, before I ever thought to ask what she was holding on to. It is the most natural mistake in the world." Chark said, rising and tipping the jar gently so the painted stone rolled out into Itzel's waiting hands. We see a stuck thing, and our instinct is to pull harder from the outside. We rarely think to ask whether the stuckness is coming from within, a grip, a fear, a refusal to release something that no amount of outside pulling can address. How did you know so quickly that this was about her grip and not the jar? The mother asked. Because I have watched this exact thing happen many times across many years of village festivals, Chark said. Children reaching into jars for hidden treats, their small fists closing too eagerly around the prize. It is rarely the jar that traps them. It is almost always the fear of losing what they have already found. The body grips tightest exactly when it is most afraid of letting go. Itzel, now clutching her stone safely against her chest, looked up at Chark with newfound trust. Will my hand always know to let go the next time I am stuck? Not always, Chark said gently. Sometimes you will forget and grip too tightly again, and someone will need to remind you the way I reminded you today. That is simply how it goes for all of us at every age. We forget to release. We are reminded. We release. And slowly, over many years, the remembering grows a little quicker each time. The mother asked one more question before Chark continued on his way. Does this happen with grown men and women too? Chark smiled. Far more, if I am honest. Children at least cry out plainly when stuck. Grown men and women grip just as tightly around far larger things and call their grip determination or responsibility or love, never noticing the grip itself is what traps them. What kinds of things? The mother asked, though her voice suggested she already half knew. Old grievances. Outcomes they have decided must happen a certain way. Versions of themselves they are afraid to release, Chark said. The jar changes shape for none of us. It is always our own hand, closed too tightly, that decides whether we walk free. The mother said nothing further, only held her daughter a little closer, turning Chark's words over long after he had continued on his way down the village path. In Mayan cosmology, there is a similar understanding of cycles, release, and renewal. The long count calendar, tracking vast cycles of time, reflects a worldview in which endings and beginnings are deeply interwoven, where a cycle must complete and release before the next one can properly begin. Two threads from this tradition deepen the lesson of Itzel's closed fist. First, Mayan cosmological teaching often speaks of the necessity of letting one cycle fully close before clinging to its remnants delays the arrival of what comes next, much as Itzel's grip on the stone delayed the very freedom that would let her keep it safely. Second, ritual practices in this tradition frequently center on conscious release, offerings given up, old cycles formally closed, recognizing that holding too tightly to what has already served its purpose can block the renewal that naturally follows surrender. A teaching preserved in Mayan tradition holds that time moves in great wheels, each one completing before the next begins, and that a person who refuses to release the closing wheel suffers needlessly, caught between what has ended and what is trying to arrive. The small girl's fist, refusing to open inside the jar, tells this same ancient story in miniature, on a much smaller and more immediate scale. You may be gripping something tonight the way Itzel gripped her painted stone, certain that loosening your hold means losing what matters most to you. Perhaps it is an old version of yourself you're not ready to release, even though holding on to it is keeping you stuck in patterns that no longer serve who you are becoming. Perhaps it is a plan, a relationship, or an outcome you are clutching so tightly that your very grip is what prevents you from receiving it in any healthy form. Consider, gently, whether your current stuckness might be coming from within rather than from outside circumstances entirely. There may be nothing actually trapping you except the fierce, frightened grip of your own hand. You do not need to release everything tonight. You only need to consider, softly, whether what you are holding would still be there, waiting safely if your hand opened just slightly. Let your fingers loosen now, literally, here in this bed, and notice how that small physical release might mirror something larger you have been gripping. Let sleep arrive the way the small stone finally arrived back into open palms, not through force, but through trust and a gentle willingness to let go. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A bucket frozen fast into the ice at the rim of a well will not be hauled free by strength alone. The harder the rope is pulled, the more the bucket's handle threatens to snap, while the ice that holds it remains entirely unmoved by human urgency. Ice does not negotiate with effort. It only yields to warmth, given time, and time is the one thing the frightened, thirsty traveler feels they do not have. Wu Wei asks us to consider that some obstacles are governed by forces entirely outside the realm of muscle and will, and that recognizing this is not weakness, but the beginning of an actual solution. The bucket will come free. It will simply come free on the terms of the thaw, not on the terms of our impatience. A traveler named Ragnar was crossing a frozen northern plain in late winter when she stopped at an old stone well to draw water for herself and her exhausted horse, only to find that the wooden bucket left at the well's edge by some earlier traveler had frozen solid into a thick crust of ice along the rim. She pulled at the rope, and the bucket would not budge, fused into the ice as firmly as if it had grown roots there. She pulled harder, bracing her boots against the stone wall of the well, and felt the old rope creak dangerously under the strain. An old woman tending a small fire nearby, wrapped in furs against the bitter cold, pulled out without rising, "You will lose that rope before you free that bucket." Ragnar turned, startled. "I need water. My horse needs water. I cannot reach the well's depths without that bucket." "Then come sit by the fire a moment, and let me tell you something my own grandmother told me, long before you were born," the old woman said. Reluctant but cold and tired, Ragnar left the bucket and crossed to the small fire, grateful at least for its warmth against her stiff hands. "There is an old story told in these lands," the woman began, "of a great chain forged to bind a fearsome wolf, a chain so strong that no force in any of the 9 worlds could break it by strength alone. The gods themselves, mightiest of all beings, tried with all their power to test its strength, and the chain held against every pull, every strike, every furious effort they could summon." "What happened?" Ragnar asked, leaning closer to the fire. "The chain was never meant to be broken by force at all," the woman said. "It was forged from things that could only be undone by their own nature unwinding: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, things so subtle and strange that brute strength had no purchase on them whatsoever. The wolf remains bound to this day, not because anyone is strong enough to hold him, but because the chain was made from precisely the kind of thing that force cannot touch." Ragnar considered this, glancing back at her frozen bucket. "You're telling me my bucket is like your chain, that pulling on it is the wrong kind of effort entirely?" "I am telling you exactly that," the old woman said, pleased. "Ice, like that ancient chain, is not impressed by strength. It does not care how strong your arms are or how desperate your thirst has become. It only answers to warmth, given time to work. You can fight ice with muscle for hours and gain nothing but a torn rope and a frustrated horse. Or you can build up that fire a little more, heat some stones in it, and carry them to the rim of the well, letting their warmth do patiently what your strength cannot do at all." Ragnar looked between the fire and the frozen bucket, weighing the woman's words against her own urgency. "But that will take time. My horse is suffering now." "Your horse will suffer longer if that rope snaps and the bucket sinks forever into the well's depths, lost to you entirely," the woman said. "A little patience now costs you less than a ruined rope and a thirstier horse an hour from now." Ragnar, swallowing her impatience, helped the old woman heat several flat stones in the fire until they glowed faintly with warmth, then carried them carefully, wrapped in cloth, to the well's icy rim. She pressed them gently against the ice surrounding the bucket's frozen edges and waited. "How long?" she asked, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. "As long as it takes," the woman said, settling beside her with the patience of someone who had waited out many winters before this one. "I cannot give you a number of minutes, because the ice does not measure itself in minutes. It only knows warmth and cold, and it will release exactly when enough warmth has reached it, no sooner, no matter how anxiously you watch it." They sat together as the stones did their slow work, steam rising faintly where warm stone met frozen rim. And after a while, Ragnar noticed the ice beginning to glisten, to soften at its edges, the bucket shifting almost imperceptibly within its frozen grip. "There," the woman said. "Now, gently. Try the rope again. Not with force, simply with steady, patient pressure, the way you might coax a sleeping child awake rather than shake them roughly into the day." Ragnar pulled, slow and even, and the bucket came free with a soft, wet sound, sliding loose from the last of its icy hold without any strain at all. "It came free so easily in the end," Ragnar said, almost disbelieving, drawing water at last for herself and her grateful horse. "It was always going to come free easily once the ice was ready," the woman said. The struggle was never really about the bucket. It was about you learning to wait for the right kind of solution instead of insisting on the only kind of solution your fear could imagine in that frightened first moment. Ragnar sat with her horse as it drank. Will I always know, the next time something feels frozen solid, whether to wait for warmth or whether the moment calls for strength? Not at first glance, the old woman admitted, but you can learn to ask before acting. Does this resist because it is hard, the way stone is hard, or because it is cold, the way ice is cold? Stone yields to a stronger arm. Ice yields only to warmth and patience. Mistake one for the other, and you waste yourself fighting the wrong battle. And if I cannot tell which it is, test gently first, the woman said. A small pull, a small warmth, a small patient pause to see what changes. The world rarely punishes a gentle test the way it punishes a reckless, full effort in the wrong direction. I think I have spent most of my life assuming everything frozen was simply stone I had not hit hard enough yet, Ragnar said. Most of us assume exactly that, the old woman said, rising to bank her fire for the night. You will reach your next town with a whole rope, a watered horse, and a lesson that cost you only a little time by this fire. In Norse mythology, there is a similar understanding of forces that cannot be overcome by strength alone. The story of the binding of the great wolf Fenrir, restrained not by ordinary chains, but by a binding fashioned from impossible, subtle materials, speaks directly to the idea that some obstacles answer only to a different kind of power than brute force. Two threads from this tradition deepen the lesson of the frozen bucket. First, Norse myth repeatedly shows even the mightiest gods failing when they rely solely on strength against forces that require cunning, patience, or an entirely different approach. Humbling reminders woven throughout the old sagas that raw power has clear limits. Second, the Norse concept of weird, the deep pattern of fate woven through all things, suggests that certain outcomes unfold according to their own necessary timing, a timing that no amount of heroic effort can hasten, only honor by waiting rightly within it. An old Norse saying, preserved in the wisdom poetry of the Havamal, advises that a wise person does not rush toward a hall before knowing whether it is friend or foe inside, valuing patient observation over hasty action. The frozen bucket, yielding only to warmth and time, tells this same old northern truth in its own small, icy way. You may have a bucket frozen into ice tonight, something in your life that no amount of pulling, however strong or determined, will free before its proper time. Perhaps it is healing from an old wound that you keep trying to will away through sheer determination, only to find the wound as present as ever, indifferent to your effort. Perhaps it is waiting for news, for a decision someone else must make, for a diagnosis or an answer that simply has not arrived yet, no matter how many times you check, hope, or strain toward it. Consider gently whether what you are facing might be more like ice than like an obstacle to be muscled through. Ice asks only for warmth and time. It does not respond to urgency, however justified that urgency feels. You do not need to free everything tonight. You only need to set down the rope for now and let warmth, patience, and time do what your effort alone cannot. Let your body soften the way the ice eventually softened, not because anyone forced it, but because warmth was finally given the time it needed to do its quiet work. And let sleep arrive the same way tonight, gently thawing the grip of the day. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight, we began with the discovery that being stuck is not always a sign to push harder. Over these 13 chapters, we let that question open slowly from many sides. We sat with a swollen door that opened only once the evening cooled it. We learned that a tight knot loosens from slack, not from strain. We watched a key find its way home, not through force, but through alignment. We saw a jammed drawer freed by a small step backward. We waited beside a rusted gate hinge for oil and patience to do what muscle could not. We rested in a grounded boat until the tide itself lifted it free. We felt a wedged foot find its way out by twisting, not pulling. We discovered that a sealed jar answers to warmth, not grip. We knelt beside a buried root that no eye from a distance could see. We untangled a fishing net by seeing its whole shape before touching a single cord. We found a millstone stopped by something smaller than a fingernail. We watched a small fist learn to open, and in opening, finally come free. And we sat by a frozen well, learning that ice answers only to warmth and time. We are not failures for finding ourselves stuck. We are not weak for needing to stop and look more closely. We are not behind simply because the moment has not yet arrived. We are capable of a quieter strength, one that waits, that feels, that listens before it acts. We are already closer to release than our gripping hands believe. The central thread running through every chapter tonight is this. Being stuck is often not a sign we need to push harder, but a sign we are pushing in the wrong way entirely. The very things we most want to force open are usually the things that open on their own, once we stop gripping the handle. This is not a lesson learned once and kept forever. It is a teaching we return to again and again. Each time some new stuck place convinces us briefly that force is the only honest response, that returning is not failure. It is simply how this kind of wisdom lives in a person, practiced, softened, and practiced again. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.